The fluorescent lights of the hospital room in Philadelphia hummed a monotonous, sterile tune. Laura Hall, exhausted but wired with a primal, electric joy, lay propped against the starched pillows. Just hours ago, she had brought Jack into the world. Her Jack. She had counted his 10 tiny fingers and 10 perfect toes, marveling at the thatch of dark hair, so like her own, and the determined set of his jaw that was pure Paul. Her husband, Paul, had been a rock, holding her hand, his face a portrait of awe and love. He had just stepped out to get a coffee and call his mother, Catherine, with the good news. Laura closed her eyes, a smile on her face, imagining the life stretching out before them, a beautiful, noisy, chaotic life with their son at its center. The door swished open, pulling her from her reverie. Paul was back, but he wasn't alone. Doctor. Miles stood beside him, his expression grim. Paul's face, which had been so full of light moments ago, was now a shattered mask of grief. His eyes were red-rimmed and vacant. He wouldn't look at her. "Laura?" "Doctor," Miles began, his voice soft but heavy, each word a stone dropping into the silent room. "There were complications, a sudden and severe pulmonary event. We did everything we could." The words didn't connect. Complications? What complications? Jack was perfect. She had held him. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice a thin thread. "Where is he? I want to see my son." It was Paul who answered, his voice cracking. "He's gone, Laurie. Our little boy is gone." A scream built in Laura's chest, but it was soundless, a blade of pure agony that sliced through her. The world dissolved into a smear of white walls and gray faces. The humming of the lights became a roar. This wasn't real. It was a nightmare, a cruel trick of her exhausted mind. But the sight of Paul finally looking at her, his face streaked with tears as he crumpled into the chair beside her bed, made it horribly, irrevocably real. Jack was gone. The cradle of her arms, which had just held him, was now an aching, empty void. The days that followed were a blur of sedatives and sorrow. Catherine Everton arrived like a storm front, her grief sharp and accusatory. She took over everything. "The arrangements need to be made, Paul," she'd said, her voice like steel. "Laura is in no condition." It was Catherine who decided on a small private service. It was Catherine who insisted on a closed casket. "It's better this way," she had declared, patting a catatonic Laura's hand with cold, dry fingers. "No one should have to see." At the funeral, Laura stood beside the tiny, polished mahogany box, feeling like a ghost at her own tragedy. Friends and distant relatives murmured condolences, their pity a physical weight. But through her fog of grief, a strange detail snagged in her mind. Paul stood stoic, his jaw clenched, a perfect statue of a grieving father. But his eyes were dry, and Catherine, for all her dramatic pronouncements of heartbreak, watched the casket not with sorrow, but with a chilling, proprietary intensity, as if guarding a precious secret rather than mourning a devastating loss. The thought was bizarre, a flicker of madness in her grief, and she pushed it away. But it left a cold spot in her heart, a tiny hairline crack in the foundation of her sorrow. The crack in Laura's heart had, over 5 years, spiderwebbed into a chasm that separated her from her husband and her life. The house they had bought in a quiet Philadelphia suburb, once filled with dreams of scraped knees and crayon on the walls, was now a pristine, silent mausoleum. The door to what would have been Jack's nursery remained permanently closed. Paul had insisted on it. "We need to move forward, Laura," he'd said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Moving forward, for Paul, meant erasing every trace of their son. There were no pictures, no keepsakes from the hospital. It was as if Jack had never been. Laura existed in a perpetual fog. She went to her part-time job at a local library, the quiet aisles a comfort, but the joy had been leached from her world. Laughter felt foreign, sunshine felt intrusive. Grief was the gray filter through which she saw everything. Her marriage, once a source of strength, had withered. Paul became a stranger who shared her bed. He was distant, his patience worn thin by her enduring sorrow. He threw himself into his work, taking on more and more projects that required him to travel. The business trips became a regular feature of their lives. Long weekends where he was unreachable, his phone going straight to voicemail. "It's a dead zone up there," he'd explain vaguely upon his return, smelling of fresh air and a life she wasn't part of. Any attempt to connect over their shared loss was met with a cold wall. On the date that would have been Jack's 5th birthday, Laura had timidly suggested they plant a tree in his memory. Paul's reaction was swift and brutal. "Why?" he snapped, his eyes flashing with an anger that seemed far too large for the question. "Why would you want to constantly reopen the wound? It's morbid, Laura. You need to let it go." He made her feel like her grief was a sickness, a character flaw he was forced to endure. The message was clear. Her sorrow was a solitary burden. He had moved on. Why couldn't she? Her friends had tried in the beginning. They brought casseroles and offered tearful hugs. But life for them had marched on. They had children of their own, their lives filled with school plays and birthday parties, painful reminders of everything Laura had lost. The invitations eventually dwindled, and she receded into the quiet emptiness of her house. She was an island, surrounded by a sea of silent grief. And Paul, the only other inhabitant that island should have had built a boat and sailed away long ago, leaving her stranded and utterly alone with the ghost of their son. The silence in the house was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a living entity, a constant, oppressive reminder of the laughter that should have been. It was the sound of a life unlived. It was a Tuesday, a day like any other, gray and muted. But a sliver of resolve had pierced through Laura's fog. She couldn't spend another day suffocating in the silence of her house. She needed noise, life, the anonymous bustle of strangers. She needed to feel like a part of the world again, even if only as a spectator. She put on a clean pair of jeans, a touch of makeup to hide the perpetual shadows under her eyes, and drove to the City Creek Mall, a sprawling complex in the King of Prussia area. She found a small table in the cacophonous food court, the chaotic symphony of 1,000 conversations, clattering trays, and crying children washing over her. For a moment, it worked. The sheer volume of life forced the silence in her head to recede. She sipped her coffee, watching families navigate the lunchtime rush. A mother wiped ketchup from her daughter's cheek. A father lifted his son high onto his shoulders. It was a mosaic of normal life, painful and yet strangely grounding. Then she heard it. A laugh. A deep, familiar bark of a laugh that cut through the din and snagged her attention. Her head snapped up, her eyes scanning the crowd. She saw him across the court, near the carousel. It was a man who looked strikingly, impossibly like Paul. His back was to her, but the set of his shoulders, the dark hair, the confident posture, it was all her husband. He was leaning down, talking to a little boy. The boy was small for his age, with a head of wild, dark, wavy hair, just like hers. Laura's heart began to hammer against her ribs. "It's just a coincidence," she told herself. "A trick of the light. Lots of men look like Paul." But she couldn't tear her eyes away. The man turned then, a wide, easy smile on his face, and the world tilted on its axis. It was Paul, her Paul, the one who was supposed to be in a meeting downtown. And the boy, now facing her, looked up at him. He had Paul's bright blue eyes, his sharp little chin, and a smile that was a perfect miniature replica of his father's. Laura felt the air leave her lungs. The noise of the food court faded to a distant roar. All she could hear was the frantic pounding of her own blood in her ears. The boy threw his head back and laughed, a sound full of pure, childish delight. "Higher, Daddy!" he shrieked with glee. "Lift me higher!" Paul scooped the boy into his arms, tossing him gently into the air. "Daddy!" The word echoed in the sudden vast emptiness of Laura's mind. "Daddy!" It was a key turning in a lock she never knew existed, opening a door to a reality so monstrous she couldn't comprehend it. Her coffee cup slipped from her numb fingers, clattering onto the floor. Paul's head turned at the sound, his eyes sweeping the area. Before he could see her, Laura scrambled to her feet, her body moving on pure, panicked instinct. She turned and fled, pushing through the crowd, a single, terrifying truth burning itself into her brain. She had just seen her husband with a living, breathing ghost. The drive home was a blur of traffic lights and street signs that Laura didn't see. She stumbled into the silent house, the quiet that was once a source of sorrow, now feeling sinister, accusatory. She sank onto the sofa, her body trembling. Had she imagined it? Was this it? The final break from reality her grief had been threatening for 5 years? Paul's words echoed in her mind. "You're not well, Laura." "It's morbid." He had planted the seeds of doubt in her own sanity for years, and now they were bearing bitter fruit. Maybe he was right. Maybe the strain had finally become too much, and her mind had conjured a phantom from its own desperate longing. But the image was seared into her memory. The boy's dark, wavy hair, his blue eyes, the joyful sound of him calling Paul Daddy. It felt too real, too specific to be a hallucination. The doubt gave way to a cold, creeping suspicion. She needed proof, one way or another. She needed to know if she was losing her mind, or if she was being lied to on a scale so grand it was almost unthinkable. Her first instinct was Paul's laptop, which he'd left on his desk. She opened it, her fingers clumsy. His browser history was pristine, filled only with work-related sites and news articles. His social media was a ghost town, updated sporadically with bland professional posts. There was nothing. It was too clean, too carefully curated. The lack of evidence was, in itself, a kind of evidence. Then, a thought struck her, sharp and clear. Catherine, Paul's mother, the woman who had managed the funeral with such cold efficiency, the woman who hated Laura's modern ideas and believed her to be a weak, overly emotional influence. Where was Paul on his long business weekends? Often, he claimed to be near the rural part of the state where his mother lived. With shaking hands, Laura typed Catherine Everton into the search bar. Her profile was locked down tighter than a fortress. Private. No visible friends, no posts. It was the profile of someone with something to hide. Laura felt a surge of frustration, nearly closing the browser. But then she saw it. Beside the private profile was a link to a public community page for the small town of New Hope, where Catherine lived. The page had posted a photo gallery from their annual Founders' Day picnic 2 months ago. Laura clicked, her heart pounding. She scrolled through dozens of photos of smiling strangers, bake sale tables, and sack races. And then she stopped. The photo was of the town mayor shaking a resident's hand. But in the background, partially obscured by a tent pole, was Catherine Everton. She was holding a paper plate with a hot dog, a strained smile on her face. And holding her other hand, looking directly at the camera with wide, familiar blue eyes, was the boy from the mall. The photo tag, generated automatically by the platform's facial recognition, hovered just below her face. Catherine Everton. The pieces didn't just click into place, they slammed together with the force of a physical blow. The boy was real. He was with Catherine. And Paul had lied about all of it. The fog in Laura's mind didn't just lift. It was burned away by the furious, white-hot glare of the truth. The hours until Paul came home were the longest of Laura's life. The shock had solidified into a cold, hard resolve. She was no longer a victim adrift in a sea of grief. She was a woman on the verge of a terrible discovery, and she needed irrefutable proof. She went into the kitchen and set her phone on the marble countertop, propped up against the fruit bowl. Into the kitchen, she opened the voice memo app and pressed the red record button, the screen going dark a moment later. It was a simple, desperate plan. When she heard Paul's key in the lock, she forced her body to remain calm, her hands steady as she stirred the pasta she was pretending to cook. He walked in, loosening his tie, the picture of a tired husband home from a long day. "Hey," he said, dropping his briefcase by the door. "Smells good." "Hey," she replied, her voice even, a marvel of self-control. "How was your day? Your meeting go well?" "Long," he said, sighing. "You know how it is. Just glad to be home." He leaned in to kiss her cheek, and she had to fight every instinct to recoil. She let the silence hang for a moment before she spoke, her voice still quiet and conversational. "I did something different today. I went to the City Creek Mall." She saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not just surprise, but alarm. "Oh? That's good, Laurie. Getting out." "It was," she said, turning from the stove to face him. It's funny who you run into. I saw you there, Paul. The denial was immediate and smooth. What? No, you didn't. I was in meetings in Center City all day. You must have seen someone who looks like me. He smiled, a placating, condescending smile that now made her skin crawl. Laura, you know your mind plays tricks on you sometimes. She held his gaze, refusing to back down. He was a little boy, Paul, about 5 years old, with dark, wavy hair and your eyes. You were lifting him up and he called you Daddy. Paul's face went pale. The facade cracked. Laura, stop this. You're upsetting yourself. You're imagining things. This was the moment. She took a breath. Then maybe I imagined this too, she said, her voice dropping, each word a perfectly aimed stone. A photo from your mother's town picnic a couple of months ago, of Catherine, and she's holding the hand of that same little boy. Checkmate. The color drained completely from his face. He stumbled back, leaning against the counter for support, as if his legs could no longer hold him. The lies were exhausted. There was nowhere left for him to run. He stared at her, his expression a mixture of terror and disbelief that she had uncovered his secret. How? He stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper. And then it all came pouring out. The confession was a torrent of pathetic excuses and blame-shifting. It was his mother's idea. Catherine, obsessed with a ridiculous, baseless family curse that claimed the firstborn Everton sons were prone to weakness and tragedy, had convinced him their son was in danger. She said you were too fragile, too modern, that you wouldn't raise him right, that you'd make him weak, Paul confessed, the words tumbling out. She said this was the only way to protect him, to raise him strong, in secret, until the danger had passed. They had bribed a hospital administrator, filed a fraudulent death certificate, and staged the entire funeral. For 5 years, Catherine had been raising their son, Jack, while Paul played the part of the grieving husband, visiting them on his business trips. He wasn't crying from remorse. He was crying from the terror of being caught. And every single monstrous word was being captured by the silent, waiting phone on the counter. Laura didn't sleep. She lay in their bed, rigid, listening to the sound of Paul's breathing in the darkness. He had cried himself to exhaustion, a pathetic, self-pitying heap. Being in the same room with him, knowing what he had done, felt like sharing a bed with a monster. The air was thick with his betrayal. Every tick of the clock was a countdown. As soon as his breathing deepened into a steady rhythm of sleep, she slipped out of bed. Her movements were silent and precise. She grabbed the phone from the kitchen, her heart hammering as she confirmed the recording was saved. It was over 2 hours long, a complete record of his disgusting confession. She threw a few essentials into an overnight bag, a change of clothes, her wallet, her car keys. The phone was the most important thing. A change of clothes. She clutched it like a holy relic as she crept out of the house, not looking back, and drove away into the pre-dawn darkness. She checked into a nondescript hotel an hour away, paying with cash. The anonymity felt like a shield. In the sterile, impersonal room, she finally allowed herself to shake, but it was a tremor of action, not of fear. The fog was gone, and in its place was a sharp, diamond-hard clarity. She knew what she had to do. Her first call was to a 24-hour hotline for a top-rated family law firm in Philadelphia. Her voice was surprisingly steady as she explained her situation in clipped, concise terms. My husband and my mother-in-law faked our son's death 5 years ago, she said. I have a full confession recorded. I need to know what to do next. The lawyer on the other end, a woman named Miss Davies, was audibly shocked, but immediately professional. Do not contact them again, she instructed. Email me that recording immediately. Then you will call the police. Tell them you have evidence of a kidnapping and felony fraud. Give them my name. We will handle the rest. Hanging up, Laura took a deep breath. This was the point of no return. She dialed 911, and when the operator answered, she calmly asked to be transferred to a detective in the Philadelphia Police Department. She was patched through to a Detective Miller, his voice gravelly with late-night exhaustion. Laura repeated her story, her voice never wavering. My son's name is Jack Everton. He was born 5 years ago at Penn Presbyterian. He is alive. He is with his grandmother, Catherine Everton, in New Hope. Ma'am, that's a very serious allegation, the detective began. I have a 2-hour audio recording of my husband confessing to the entire thing, Laura interrupted. I just sent it to my lawyer, and I can forward the file to you right now. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Okay, ma'am, Detective Miller said, his tone shifting from skepticism to urgency. Send me that file. Don't go anywhere. We'll be in touch. After she hung up, Laura sat on the edge of the bed, the phone still in her hand. She had done it. She had detonated a bomb in the center of her own life, and the fallout would be immense. But through the terror, a single, powerful emotion surged through her. Hope. For the first time in 5 years, it wasn't a vague wish. It was a tangible, reachable thing. She was no longer grieving a ghost. She was fighting for her son. The authorities moved with astonishing speed. The audio file was undeniable, a confession so detailed and damning that it served as a roadmap for the investigation. Warrants were issued for Paul and Catherine Everton. Within hours, Detective Miller called Laura back. Miss Hall, he said, Paul Everton is in custody. The state police and the local sheriff's department in New Hope have served the warrant on Catherine Everton's residence. They have the child. He is safe. The word safe was a release valve. Laura choked back a sob, whispering thank you over and over. The detective explained that Child Protective Services had temporary custody and that they wanted to facilitate a reunion as soon as possible. He gave her the address of a family services center in a neutral suburb. Walking into the center was surreal. The building was designed to be welcoming, with brightly colored walls and children's drawings, but it felt clinical and bureaucratic. A kind but firm social worker named Maria sat Laura down in a small private room. Laura, I need to prepare you, Maria said gently. Your son's name is Jack. He is 5 years old. As far as he knows, Catherine is his primary caregiver. His entire world. He believes Paul is his father who visits on weekends. He has never heard of you. This is going to be a shock for him. He will be scared and confused. We need to go slowly. Laura nodded, her throat tight. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times. A tearful, cinematic embrace, her son instantly knowing her. The reality, she now understood, would be far more complicated and painful. Maria left and returned a few moments later, holding the hand of a small boy. It was him, Jack. He had her dark, wavy hair and Paul's bright, piercing blue eyes. He was wearing tiny jeans and a dinosaur t-shirt. He looked smaller in person, more fragile. He hid behind Maria's leg, his eyes wide with fear, staring at the strange woman who was openly weeping in front of him. Laura's heart shattered and reformed in the same instant. This beautiful, terrified child was hers. She fought the overwhelming urge to run to him, to scoop him up and hold him forever. Instead, she followed Maria's instructions. She knelt down on the floor, making herself small. Hi, Jack, she whispered, her voice thick with tears. My name is Laura. You have beautiful hair. Jack flinched at the sound of his name from a stranger. He didn't speak. He just clutched Maria's leg tighter, his thumb finding its way into his mouth. The rejection was a fresh, sharp wound, but Laura knew this wasn't his fault. He was the ultimate victim in all of this. She stayed on the floor, simply existing in the same space as him. She spoke to him softly about the drawings on the wall, about his cool dinosaur shirt. She didn't push. She didn't press. It was a slow, agonizing, and tender negotiation across an impossible divide. After what felt like an eternity, he took a hesitant step away from Maria, his blue eyes studying her with a child's intense curiosity. It wasn't an embrace, it wasn't recognition, but it was a start. It was the first fragile thread of a bond that had been stolen from them 5 years ago, and Laura would spend the rest of her life weaving it into something strong and unbreakable. 6 months later, the sterile silence of Laura's old house was a distant memory, replaced by the vibrant, sometimes chaotic sounds of life. She and Jack lived in a bright, 2-bedroom apartment in a new neighborhood, a place with no ghosts in the closets. The walls were covered not in tasteful, neutral art, but in Jack's crayon drawings of lopsided suns and green-striped tigers. The legal storm had raged, and the wreckage was extensive. Paul and Catherine Everton, facing overwhelming evidence, had been convicted on charges of kidnapping, conspiracy, and filing false government documents. Their sentences were long, ensuring they would be behind bars for most of Jack's childhood. Laura had been granted full and sole custody. The reunion was not a single event, but an ongoing process. The first few weeks had been brutally difficult. Jack had cried for Grandma at night, his confusion and grief a heartbreaking echo of the pain Laura had endured. He was wary of her, a stranger who had suddenly become the center of his universe. There were tantrums, nightmares, and long stretches of resentful silence. But Laura met his pain with a bottomless well of patience she never knew she possessed. They had started therapy, both for herself and for Jack. His sessions involved play, using dolls and drawing to process a betrayal too complex for his 5-year-old mind to articulate. Laura's sessions helped her navigate the treacherous landscape of her own trauma and the unique challenges of parenting a child who had been stolen from her. Slowly, painstakingly, they were building a new life, brick by brick. They established routines, pancake breakfasts on Saturdays, trips to the park after school, reading 2 books every single night before bed. Laura learned that Jack loved blueberries but hated bananas, that he was terrified of thunderstorms, and that his favorite dinosaur was the Stegosaurus. She was discovering her son, one small, precious detail at a time. One evening, as she was tucking him into bed, she finished reading his favorite story. He was quiet, his blue eyes watching her in the soft glow of his dinosaur nightlight. She leaned down to kiss his forehead, as she did every night. "Good night, my sweet boy," she whispered. He reached up and put his small hand on her cheek. "Good night, Mommy," he said, his voice soft with sleep. He had called her Mom before, usually prompted or in imitation. But this time, it was different. Usually prompted, it was easy, natural. It was a statement of fact. Laura's breath caught in her throat, and a wave of warmth spread through her chest, a profound and deeply healing peace. She stayed there for a long moment, her hand over his, listening to the sound of his steady breathing. The scars of the past would always be there, a part of their story. But they were no longer gaping wounds. They were faint silver lines that mapped the incredible painful journey that had finally, against all odds, brought them home to each other.